In the late 1970s and through the 1980s, one address in Vancouver needed no street sign to be found. Seymour Street. On Boxing Day, hundreds of people camped there, overnight, in the rain, in the cold. Not for concert tickets, not for turkey, for records. 21 stores once stretched from Victoria to Winnipeg. Musicians talked about the chain that kept its prices so low. Tower Records, America's biggest record retailer, quietly dropped its plans to ever open in the city. Bright orange bags were a familiar sight across Western Canada for nearly 50 years. Then, in less than 4 months in 2008, every single store went dark. How does a company that once frightened off the largest record chain in America vanish without a single location left standing? For anyone who ever unwrapped a cassette bought under that orange sign, this is the story of what really killed A&B Sound, and what disappeared along with it. Fred Steiner did not start out selling music. In 1959, he opened a small storefront at 571 Granville Street in downtown Vancouver, and what he sold at first was television sets, stereo consoles, and radio equipment. Vancouver in 1959 was a city still finding its post-war footing, a port town growing fast, full of young families buying their first home appliances on credit, eager for the modern conveniences that television and hi-fi sound represented. Steiner's idea was simple, almost stubbornly so. Sell everything for less than anyone else, and make it up in volume. It was not a glamorous strategy. It did not promise the plush carpeting or the personal service of the department stores downtown. What it promised was a number on a price tag that nobody else could match. That single principle, undercut and keep undercutting, would define the company for the next 5 decades, for better and eventually for worse. Later that same year, Steiner added something to the shelves almost as an afterthought: records, vinyl LPs stacked next to the television sets. It did not take long to notice which product moved faster. Music did not need installation. It did not need a truck to deliver it. A customer could walk in, flip through a bin, and walk out minutes later with something in their hands. Steiner leaned into it, and by the 1960s, music had become the store's true identity, even as televisions and stereo equipment remained on the shelves. Picture the store on an ordinary afternoon in that first year. Granville Street outside, streetcars still running past, the smell of fresh paint and new electronics inside, that faintly metallic plastic scent that hung around every appliance store of the era. Bins of records lined up along the walls, sleeves slightly curled from handling. A radio playing somewhere near the counter, tuned to whatever station Steiner or his clerk preferred that day. No music playing through speakers built for showroom demonstration, just a small radio doing double duty as both entertainment and proof that the equipment for sale actually worked. The first customers were not collectors or audiophiles. They were working people, dock workers, shop clerks, young couples furnishing an apartment for the first time, drawn in by a price that was, without exception, a few dollars lower than what they'd find anywhere else downtown. Word spread the way it always did before advertising budgets existed. One neighbor telling another where to find the cheapest turntable in the city. Steiner's belief, repeated by those who worked alongside him in later years, was almost defiantly plain. The customer should never have a reason to shop anywhere else on price alone. Everything else, the service, the atmosphere, the loyalty, could be built on top of that foundation, but the foundation itself was non-negotiable. It was a philosophy built for growth. It would also, decades later, become the very thing that left the company with nowhere to hide when its competitors learned to play the same game. By 1970, the original Granville Street location had been outgrown. Steiner moved the store 6 blocks over to 556 Seymour Street, a modest move on a map, but one that would place A&B Sound at the exact address an entire generation of Vancouverites would come to know by heart. What began as a storefront selling televisions was about to become something else entirely, the beating heart of a music culture that would define a city for the next 30 years. The 1970s through the mid-1990s were the decades A&B Sound became something more than a store. On Seymour Street, the company expanded to 3 full floors by 1980, and a year later opened a second Vancouver location on Hastings Street near the Burnaby border. In 1984, a fourth store went up on Southwest Marine Drive. Fred Steiner retired in 1987, and his son Nick took over as president. But the culture he inherited was already fully formed, and it would carry the company through its most beloved years. By then, Seymour Street had earned a nickname that locals used without irony, Record Row. A&B Sound anchored one end of a stretch of downtown Vancouver that also held Sam the Record Man, Trax, Noise, and Odyssey Imports. A corridor where a person could spend an entire Saturday moving from one record bin to the next, comparing prices, comparing selection, comparing which staff member actually knew their jazz from their blues. A&B more often than not won on both counts, the deepest catalog in the city and the lowest price on nearly everything in it. Lane Orr, who would later become the company's vice president, remembered the flagship store this way. Customers who arrived when the doors opened at 9 in the morning and were still there when the doors closed at 6 that evening. An entire day spent in one building, armloads of classical records, jazz records, whatever else caught their attention along the way. This was not a quick errand. For a certain kind of Vancouver music lover, A&B Sound was where a Saturday went to be spent. The pricing strategy that Fred Steiner had built the company on became, in these years, something close to civic legend. A&B set its price, and Future Shop, its closest rival in consumer electronics, would follow. The gap was rarely more than a few dollars, but in a city obsessed with finding the better deal, those few dollars mattered enormously. A&B's reputation for rock-bottom prices grew so strong that Tower Records, the American giant that had built an empire on deep catalogs and cultural cachet, reportedly looked at opening a Vancouver location and walked away. A city where the local record store already undercut everyone by that margin was not a city Tower wanted to compete in. Nowhere was that reputation more visible than on Boxing Day. It became, without any single person planning it, an annual ritual. Customers lining up outside the Seymour Street store, hours before opening, sometimes overnight, wrapped in winter coats against a Vancouver December that could turn bitterly cold and wet. They weren't waiting for concert tickets or a new video game console. They were waiting for the doors to open on a day when A&B's already low prices dropped further still. Parents brought children who would, years later, bring their own children to do exactly the same thing. A small, freezing tradition passed down like a family recipe. Inside, the smell was distinctive, and for anyone who grew up with it, unforgettable. Shrink-wrapped plastic, the faint dust of cardboard record sleeves, the ozone hum of 100 stereo demo units running at once. The sound was constant, too. Competing speakers, playing different albums in different corners of the store, staff calling out prices, the click of jewel cases being stacked at the register. It was chaotic in a way that felt somehow exactly right. Employees who worked the floor in these years describe an atmosphere closer to a music club than a retail chain. Staff were expected to know their stock, not just where an album sat on the shelf, but what it sounded like, who else a customer might like if they were buying it. That kind of floor knowledge was part of what kept people coming back, even as bigger, blander competitors opened elsewhere in the city. A&B wasn't just selling music. It was where a teenager discovered a genre, where a father took his son to buy his first guitar amp, where a birthday gift became a ritual of standing at the counter and asking the clerk what was worth hearing that month. By the early 1990s, the chain had pushed east across the province and into Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba. Victoria, Surrey, the Metrotown area of Burnaby, Nanaimo, and beyond. Every new store carried the same formula that had worked since 1959. Undercut the competition, stock deeper than anyone else, and let the customers do the advertising themselves. One Boxing Day story at a time. What none of them could have known, standing in that line in the cold, holding their orange plastic bags, was how completely the product itself was about to change. The compact disc that they were buying by the dozen, the format that had made A&B's catalog deeper and more profitable than ever, was, within a decade, going to become something a person could get for free, instantly, without ever leaving their house. The growth that carried A&B Sound across Western Canada was never dictated by a boardroom 5-year plan. It grew the way Fred Steiner had always run the business, one successful store proving the model worked, followed by another opening wherever the next opportunity looked strong enough. There was no franchise system, no outside partners buying in. Every new location belonged entirely to the Steiner family, funded by the profits of the stores that came before it. It was expansion built on the company's own momentum, not on borrowed ambition. The first move beyond Vancouver came in 1977, with a second location in Victoria, housed in a building with a strange and layered history of its own. Once the city's first hospital, later a brothel, before A&B Sound turned it into a record store. It was an unglamorous building for what would become, in time, a beloved neighborhood fixture. 3 years later, the Seymour Street flagship expanded to 3 full floors, and by 1981, a new store had gone up on Hastings Street, close to the Burnaby border. In 1984, a fourth Vancouver area location opened on Southwest Marine Drive. The city that had started it all was, within 25 years, home to 4 separate A&B Sound stores, a density that spoke to just how deeply the chain had rooted itself in local shopping habits. The pace only accelerated after Nick Steiner took over as president in 1987, following his father's retirement. New stores opened in Surrey that same year, in Burnaby's Metrotown area in 1988, and in Nanaimo in 1990. From there, the chain pushed outward in a direction few of Vancouver's other retailers had bothered to follow. East, across the provincial border, into Alberta, then Saskatchewan, then Manitoba. By the early 1990s, a customer could walk into an A&B Sound in Winnipeg and find the same deep catalog, the same rock-bottom pricing, and the same orange bags that a shopper in Vancouver had known for decades. This was, in every sense, a regional empire, one that never once tried to cross into the United States and never needed to. Western Canada alone gave the company enough room to grow for nearly 40 years. Each new location followed a familiar physical footprint, a single large format store, easy to reach by car, with parking out front and shelves organized less for elegance than for volume. Deep bins, tightly packed aisles, and a layout built to move as much stock as possible through the doors. For the employees hired to staff these new locations, joining A&B Sound in these years meant something specific. It was for many a first real job, one where a teenager with a passion for music could turn that passion into a paycheck, working a sales floor that rewarded actually knowing your stock. But it also meant absorbing the pressure that came with the company's core promise. Every new store had to hold the same prices as the ones before it, which meant thinner margins spread across more locations, more staff, more overhead, all resting on the same unshakable rule Fred Steiner had set in 1959. Never let a customer find a better price down the street. What the expansion did not include in these years was any real diversification away from that formula. Other retailers were beginning to broaden what they sold, or to experiment with new store formats, new services, new ways of drawing in customers beyond price alone. A&B Sound, instead, simply did more of what had always worked. Deeper catalogs, more locations, the same aggressive pricing, repeated at a larger scale each time. It was a strategy that had never failed the company before, and there was little reason yet to think it ever would. By the time the chain reached its full geographic spread, Victoria to Winnipeg, 21 stores across 4 provinces, A&B Sound had become something closer to an institution than a business. It employed hundreds of people who had grown up shopping there themselves. It had built a physical footprint that touched nearly every mid-sized city in Western Canada. And it had done all of this without ever changing the core idea Fred Steiner started with in that small Granville Street storefront. Undercut everyone and let the volume carry you. But an empire built entirely on a single, unchanging formula carries its own quiet risk. The strategy that built 21 stores in 4 provinces had never been tested against a competitor willing to match its prices dollar for dollar, and it had certainly never been tested against a product that customers could simply stop paying for altogether. Both of those tests were coming, and neither one was very far away. By the early 2000s, A&B Sound had reached the outer edge of what the formula could achieve. 21 stores stood across British Columbia, Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba, doing close to $300 million in business every year. It was no longer simply a place to buy music. It had become, for an entire region, a kind of shorthand, the default answer to the question of where you went when you needed a record, a stereo, a television, or a Christmas gift that had to be good and had to be cheap. That shorthand showed up in places that had nothing to do with retail. In Vancouver slang, A&B became a verb of sorts, something you'd simply say you were doing, the way another city might say they were going to the mall. Local writers, decades later, would still explain the term to newcomers the way you'd explain any piece of hometown vocabulary. A&B Sound, the record and electronics store known for its Boxing Day sales and its rock-bottom prices, so deeply woven into the city's identity that its name needed no further explanation to anyone who'd grown up there. Television and radio kept that identity alive year-round. A&B's advertising was constant and instantly recognizable. The same aggressive price promises repeated on local stations so often that jingles and slogans became part of the region's background noise. The kind of ad a person could recite from memory decades later without ever having tried to memorize it. Competitors like Future Shop ran their own campaigns. But A&B's reputation for being first to cut a price gave its advertising a credibility the newer chains struggled to match. When A&B said a price was the lowest in the city, people largely believed it, because for 40 years it usually had been. For employees working the floor during these peak years, there was a particular kind of pride in wearing the name. Staff described a sense of being part of something bigger than a job, a store that customers trusted, that neighbors recommended to each other, that had outlasted wave after wave of competition simply by refusing to blink first on price. Sales floors stayed busy nearly every day of the week, not just during the Boxing Day rush, and staff who had been there since the 1980s trained a new generation of clerks in the same unwritten rule that had defined the company from the start. Know your stock, know your customer, and never let them walk out feeling like they overpaid. That sense of continuity ran through families as naturally as it ran through the staff. Parents who had lined up on Seymour Street as teenagers in the 1970s were, by the 1980s, bringing their own children into A&B stores across the region, passing down not just a shopping habit, but a story. The child heard about the year it snowed on Boxing Day, and the line still didn't move. The teenager got their first stereo system from the same chain their parents had trusted for their own first stereo, 20 years earlier. It was retail loyalty built the slow way, one generation handing it to the next without ever needing to be asked. And it was, above all, a regional institution in the truest sense, present in the small talk of a Nanaimo living room and a Winnipeg apartment alike, unified not by a national ad campaign, but by the simple, repeated experience of walking through those doors and knowing, with total confidence, exactly what you'd find. A wall of new releases, a price nobody nearby could beat, and a staff member who could tell you, without hesitation, whether the album in your hand was worth the money. This was the era the company would spend the rest of its history trying and failing to hold on to. 21 stores, $300 million. A name so familiar it had become part of the language itself. There was no sign from the outside that anything was wrong. The stores were full, the Boxing Day lines were as long as ever, the advertising ran on schedule, the same promises it had made for 40 years. But somewhere in those crowded aisles, in the very years A&B Sound felt most permanent, the ground underneath the entire business had already begun, quietly, to shift. The product people were lining up to buy in physical form was, for the first time in the company's history, about to become something they could get without a store at all. Lane Orr remembered it starting around the year 2000, though at the time nobody would have called it a turning point. It looked, if anything, like ordinary friction, the kind any business absorbs and moves past. Only later would it become clear that 2000 was the year the ground began to shift under A&B Sound, quietly enough that almost nobody in the checkout line noticed. The first crack came from a direction the company had never had to defend before: the product itself. The MP3 had existed since the 1990s, But by the early 2000s, it had gone from a curiosity among tech-savvy teenagers to something an ordinary customer understood and, increasingly, used. A compact disc that once seemed like the only way to own a song was suddenly one option among several, and one of those other options was free. A&B Sound had spent 40 years winning customers by beating every competitor's price on physical media. It had no answer and no real plan for a competitor that charged nothing at all. The second crack ran through the store itself, in a place the company had always considered a strength, its pricing war with Future Shop. For years, A&B set a price, and Future Shop matched it. A rivalry the company had treated almost as a game it consistently won. But as the two chains kept undercutting each other deeper into the 1990s and early 2000s, the contest stopped being about winning customers and started being, as one longtime observer later put it, heavily ego-driven. A fight over who could go lower, even when going lower made no financial sense at all. A&B could have priced its stock high enough to stay profitable and still competitive. Instead, prices were set at levels one retail analyst would later call absolutely senseless, margins thin enough that the company had little room left to invest in the very things that might have helped it survive what was coming: better stores, better technology, better paid staff. The third crack was smaller, almost invisible at first, but telling in its own way. Customers began taking advantage of the store's famously liberal return policy, a policy built in an earlier era when trust between the store and its regulars ran deep enough that nobody worried about it being exploited. By the early 2000s, that same generosity had become a quiet drain, one more small leak in a business already running on thinner margins than it could really afford. None of this reached the customers standing in line. If you walked into the Seymour Street store in 2001 or 2002, you would have seen exactly what you'd always seen: shelves stacked deep, staff who knew their stock, prices lower than anywhere else in the city. The Boxing Day line still formed every December, still full of families bundled against the cold, still convinced, with good reason, as far as they could tell, that A&B Sound would be there the following year, and the year after that, the way it always had been. That was the particular cruelty of how this decline unfolded. The customers had no reason yet to doubt the company. The company itself, from the inside, was already starting to understand what it was up against. How does a business that had spent 4 decades outlasting every rival simply by cutting its prices survive a competitor that charges nothing at all? That was the question sitting, unspoken, inside every boardroom conversation A&B Sound was starting to have. Even as its storefronts, its advertising, and its Boxing Day crowds gave no outward hint that anything had changed. Inside the company, the response was neither denial nor decisive action, but something closer to hesitation. The formula that had built the empire, undercut, expand, repeat, had no obvious next step when the thing being undercut was a file that cost nothing to copy. Executives could see competitors like Future Shop absorbing the same pressures, could see the broader industry starting to talk about digital downloads as more than a passing trend. But changing course meant abandoning the very identity the company had spent 40 years building. The promise that A&B always had the lowest price on everything, always. Walking away from that promise felt, to a company built entirely on it, almost unthinkable. And so, through the early 2000s, A&B Sound did largely what it had always done: held its prices as low as it could, kept its stores full, kept its advertising running, and waited to see whether the shift toward digital music was a passing storm or the start of something permanent. It was a reasonable bet, given everything the company's history had taught it. It would turn out to be the wrong one, not because the strategy had failed before, but because, for the first time in the company's history, the ground it was standing on had actually moved. The stores stayed busy. The lines stayed long. But somewhere behind the counter, in numbers that customers never saw, the business that had once seemed unshakable had already begun, quietly and almost imperceptibly, to come apart. By 2001, the company that Fred Steiner had spent 4 decades shaping was already changing hands in ways customers never saw. Nick Steiner, who had taken over as president from his father in 1987, stepped aside from that role that year. though he remained chairman. Longtime executive Tim Howley moved into the president and CEO position, a leadership change made quietly without fanfare, at almost the exact moment the pressures from digital music and pricing wars were starting to compound. The company that had always been run by a Steiner was now, for the first time, being steered day to day by someone outside the family. The decision that would prove most fatal in hindsight was not a single dramatic choice, but a refusal to make one. As digital downloads eroded the value of the CD catalog that had built the company's fortune, and as the price war with Future Shop kept margins thinner every year, A&B Sound's leadership stayed committed to the one strategy that had never failed them before: undercut everyone, hold the line, wait for the market to stabilize. Retail analyst David Ian Gray, looking back on this period, offered a blunt assessment that A&B could have priced itself high enough to stay healthy and still remain the cheapest option in the city, freeing up money to reinvest in its stores and its staff. Instead, the company kept setting prices low enough to make that reinvestment impossible, a decision Gray described as making no real business sense at all. By 2005, the math finally caught up. A&B Sound filed for bankruptcy protection, listing $57 million in liabilities against assets worth considerably less. It was the first time in the company's 46-year history that its survival was no longer a given. Later that year, a Richmond, BC computer manufacturer named Shonix Technology purchased A&B Sound for an estimated $25 million, a fraction of what the company had once been worth at the height of its $300 million years. The name stayed on the storefronts. The ownership and the direction did not. What followed was not a single collapse, but a slow, deliberate contraction, store by store, city by city. Both Winnipeg locations closed in 2005. The Hastings Street store in Vancouver closed in January 2006. That August, the Red Deer, Regina, and Saskatoon stores shut their doors within weeks of each other. The high-profile downtown Calgary location, one of the chain's most visible outposts outside British Columbia, closed in February 2005, though the city kept locations in its northeast and deep south for a while longer. In March 2007, the downtown Edmonton store closed as well, with vague promises of a replacement location that would in time never fully materialize the way customers were told it would. Piece by piece, the regional empire that had once stretched from Victoria to Winnipeg was being quietly dismantled. For the people working inside these stores, the experience of this period was one of accumulating uncertainty rather than a single defining crisis. Employees watched sister locations close one after another, never entirely sure whether their own store would be next or when. Some transferred to nearby locations that were still open. Others simply lost the jobs they had held for years, sometimes for decades. Jobs that, for many, had started as a first part-time gig in high school and had quietly become a career. There was no company-wide announcement warning them what was coming. There was only the slow, visible pattern of stores disappearing from the map, one region at a time. Shonix, to its credit, did not appear to be asset stripping the company outright. This was not, by most accounts, a private equity playbook of debt loading and deliberate extraction. What accounts from the period suggest instead is something quieter and, in its own way, sadder. An ownership group that brought in retail experts to try to engineer a real turnaround, but never gave those experts the freedom or the resources the job actually required. The company understood at some level that it needed to change. It simply never fully committed to changing enough or fast enough to matter. Meanwhile, the product itself kept slipping away. The deep CD catalog that had once been A&B's single greatest advantage over its rivals became, year by year, a smaller and smaller part of what customers actually wanted to buy. Music downloads flattened the entire category that the company had built its identity around for nearly 5 decades. Competitors like Virgin Megastores and HMV had already been squeezing A&B's music sales from one direction. The shift to digital squeezed it from every direction at once. There was no single last great CD moment. No dramatic recipe changed the way a restaurant might lose its signature dish. The erosion was quieter than that, a steady thinning of foot traffic in the very aisles that had once been Record Row's beating heart. By 2008, what remained of the chain bore little resemblance to the 21-store empire of just 3 years earlier. New locations had opened in North Vancouver and Pitt Meadows, even as older ones closed, and stores in Kelowna, South Calgary, and Surrey had been relocated. Small signs of a company still trying to adapt, still trying to find a configuration that worked, even as the ground kept shifting beneath every decision it made. On December 15, 2007, a new location even opened in Langford near Victoria. A strange, almost defiant gesture of expansion in the middle of what was, by then, an unmistakable decline. 3 weeks into January 2008, the Delta store closed. The company was, by every visible measure, running out of room to maneuver. What insiders understood by this point, even if it was never said aloud in a press release, was that A&B Sound was no longer fighting to grow. It was fighting simply to find a size small enough to survive on. A handful of stores, differentiated enough from the mainstream retailers around them, that could still turn a profit without the volume the company had always depended on. Gray, reflecting on this period, noted that plenty of retailers succeed with just 4 or 5 locations, but only by being genuinely different from everyone else on the market. And by 2008, there was very little left that made A&B Sound different. Its cachet had been built almost entirely on music sales, and music sales, the very foundation the company was named for, had flattened into something the internet could offer for free. The company that had once frightened off Tower Records with its prices now found itself unable to compete with something that had no price at all. The decisions that would end A&B Sound had already, quietly, been made. What remained was only the public unraveling, and it was coming faster than almost anyone still shopping in those stores could have imagined. The first sign that the public could actually see came in May 2008. The flagship store on Seymour Street, the same address that had anchored Record Row since 1965, the same building where teenagers had once spent entire Saturdays flipping through bins of vinyl, announced a 50% off moving sale. 2 full floors of retail space shrank down to 1. For anyone who had grown up with that store, the sight of half-empty shelves and clearance signs taped across the windows was unmistakable, even before anyone in management said the word closing out loud. What followed did not take years, it took months. On July 23, 2008, the company made the decision to close its Nanaimo location. 6 days later, on July 29th, came a closure that stunned even employees who had watched the chain shrink for years. The Calgary North store, a location that had, by most accounts, still been profitable, was shut down without warning. Staff and management arrived to find the front doors locked and a notice taped to the glass, informing them the branch was finished. No meeting, no transition period, just a locked door where a workplace had been the day before. With Calgary North gone, and the South location already dismantled months earlier after barely a year in its relocated space, A&B Sound's presence in Calgary, a city it had served for decades, ceased to exist in the space of a single summer. Then came August 12, 2008. Both remaining Vancouver stores, Seymour Street and Marine Drive, closed their doors for the final time. The company released a short statement. Both locations had been struggling, and management had determined the right business decision was to focus resources on the stores that remained. It was a clinical sentence for what amounted to the end of an era. Seymour Street, the address that had given Vancouver the phrase, going to A&B, the corner that had drawn campers into the winter cold every Boxing Day since the 1970s, was simply gone. Retail analyst David Ian Gray, watching the closures unfold, told a local reporter he believed the chain was finished, that yes, closing stores had been necessary, but the brand itself had reached a point where its identity was already lost, and he did not see a way for the company to restart it. The contraction did not stop there. On August 29th, the Langley store in Greater Vancouver closed. On September 18th, Pitt Meadows followed. On October 23rd, both the South Edmonton and Abbotsford locations shut down, though both briefly reopened for a few final days that same week, not to resume normal business, but to run liquidation sales, emptying whatever inventory remained onto discount tables one last time. How does a chain that once operated 21 stores across 4 provinces disappear from an entire region in under 4 months? There was no single dramatic bankruptcy filing that ended it all at once. There was only this: one city after another, one locked door after another, each closure a little more expected than the one before it, until almost nothing was left standing. On October 15th, 2008, weeks before the end formally arrived, A&B Sound quietly dropped its store credit card, issued through Wells Fargo. No replacement card was offered. For longtime customers who had carried that card in their wallets for years, a small, ordinary detail of daily life. It was one more quiet signal that the company they'd trusted was no longer planning for a future. The last store standing was in North Vancouver. On November 7, 2008, it closed its doors for the final time, and A&B Sound officially announced it had gone out of business. The company's own statement, posted on its website for employees and customers, spoke of the need to restructure the business to work in today's market. Language that suggested, even at the very end, a belief that the company might yet continue in some form. It did not. A&B Sound joined a growing list of Canadian music retailers that had already disappeared in those same years. Among them, A&A Records and Sam the Record Man, the very store that had once stood beside A&B on Record Row, sharing the same sidewalk, the same customers, the same slow decline. The final numbers, when they came, told the story with a bluntness the company's own statements never quite managed. In this second and final bankruptcy filing, A&B Sound's total assets stood at $1,564,640. Its total liabilities, $12,067,361. A company that had once done $300 million a year in business, that had once operated 21 stores across 4 provinces, closed its final ledger owing nearly 8 times what it owned. For the employees who had lived through that final year, watching one sister's store after another go dark, never certain if their own location would be next, there was no single dramatic ending, no company-wide meeting where the news was delivered all at once. There was only the accumulation of locked doors, city by city, until the pattern became impossible to misread. Some had worked at A&B Sound for 20 years or more, hired as teenagers under Fred Steiner's original philosophy of knowing your stock and knowing your customer, watching that philosophy quietly become irrelevant in a market that no longer needed a knowledgeable clerk to help you find a song. For customers, the ending arrived differently depending on where they lived. A locked door in Calgary in July, a 50% off sign in Vancouver in May, a final liquidation table in Abbotsford in October. There was no single last day that everyone shared, the way there might have been for a chain that closed all at once. Instead, A&B Sound disappeared the way it had grown, unevenly, store by store, across a region that had spent nearly 5 decades treating it as a fixture too familiar to imagine losing. By November 7, 2008, the company that Fred Steiner had built from a single storefront on Granville Street in 1959, the company that had once made America's largest record chain reconsider ever coming to Vancouver, no longer existed. What remained were 17 empty buildings scattered across British Columbia and Alberta, a name that Vancouverites still used as casual shorthand for a place that no longer opened its doors, and thousands of orange plastic bags tucked away in closets and basements, holding records that nobody sold that way anymore. In the years after A&B Sound disappeared, the customers it once served did not stop buying music and electronics. They simply stopped buying them the way they always had. Best Buy, which had absorbed Future Shop in the years before A&B's collapse, inherited much of the consumer electronics business the two chains had once fought over. But the deeper shift went further than any single competitor could claim credit for. Streaming and digital downloads had already made the compact disc itself feel like an artifact, and no surviving retailer, not Best Buy, not anyone else, ever needed a store the size of A&B's flagship to sell what customers now carried in their pockets instead. There was no real attempt to revive A&B Sound as a working business. Unlike some defunct retailers whose names get licensed out or relaunched as online-only ventures, A&B's remaining inventory simply sat in limbo after the final store closed in 2008. A liquidation sale planned for the Abbotsford location was advertised, then canceled without explanation. The stock disappeared from public view for nearly 3 years. Then, in June 2011, it resurfaced. Not through any company announcement, but through an auction house. Able Auctions in Vancouver liquidated what remained of A&B Sound's inventory on a single Saturday, closing out, almost as an afterthought, the physical remnants of a business that had once moved $300 million a year. The brand's true afterlife, when it finally came, arrived from an unexpected direction. In 2021, the Steiner family, through Steiner Properties, the company Nick Steiner's own son Jacob now helps run, released a line of A&B Sound branded clothing. T-shirts followed later by hooded sweatshirts printed locally in East Vancouver. It joined a small catalog of other nostalgic Vancouver throwback apparel the company had produced, evoking other closed local institutions the city still remembered fondly. A&B Sound did not come back as a store. It came back as a symbol, something people could wear, rather than something people could shop at. What the Steiner family kept in the meantime was something more tangible, the buildings themselves. 17 properties that once housed A&B Sound locations remained under the ownership of Steiner Properties, scattered across British Columbia and Alberta, long after the stores inside them had gone dark. Some of these buildings found new purposes. Others sat empty for years, waiting on permits, waiting on plans that moved slowly or not at all. The former A&B Sound location in downtown Nanaimo stood without a tenant for well over a decade after its 2008 closure. A building the Steiner family's own developer, Jacob Steiner, was still trying to redevelop years later, its long vacancy at one point becoming a site homeless residents were asked to relocate from. A downtown Edmonton store became, eventually, the site of Norquest College. Empty storefronts, in other words, do not simply disappear when a company does. They linger, waiting for a city to decide what to do with the space a beloved business left behind. For the industry itself, A&B Sound's collapse became something close to a case study. Not of mismanagement exactly, but of a business model that had never needed to change until suddenly there was no more time left to change it. Retail analyst David Ian Gray, reflecting on the chain's end, called it one of those iconic stories of a sector disappearing because of the internet, noting that no matter how good a retailer had been, nothing they could have done would have let them withstand what was happening to physical media sales industry-wide. It was not, in his telling, really a story of one company's mistakes. It was a story of an entire category of retail, record store specifically, being made obsolete by a technology no single chain could outprice or outcompete. The communities that had depended on A&B Sound felt the loss in smaller, more local ways. A downtown storefront that had anchored foot traffic for decades sat empty. A first job that generations of Vancouver teenagers had counted on no longer existed to be counted on. The specific kind of knowledge that clerks had built up over years, knowing an entire catalog by memory, knowing what to recommend to a customer standing uncertainly at the counter, had no obvious place to go once the store that valued it was gone. What does it mean when the one place your whole community gathered around a shared passion simply stops existing, and nothing quite like it ever takes its place? Best Buy sells electronics. Streaming services sell music, in a sense, but neither one recreates what Record Row once offered, a corner of a city built entirely around the specific communal joy of searching for something good, together, in person, with people who knew exactly what you were looking for. Picture Seymour Street on a December evening, sometime in the 1980s. The cold has settled in the way it does in Vancouver in winter. Damp, bone deep, carried on wind off the water. A line stretches down the block, coats zipped to the chin, breath rising in small clouds under the streetlights. Nobody is complaining. This is Boxing Day Eve, and everyone in that line knows exactly what they're waiting for. Inside, the store hums with a particular kind of noise, competing stereo demos playing different albums in different corners, the rustle of shrink wrap, the click of jewel cases stacking at the register, a clerk somewhere calling out a price to a customer 3 aisles over. The air smells like new plastic and cardboard, and faintly, like the ozone hum of 100 speakers running at once. Someone hands a cashier a stack of records and receives, in return, a bright orange plastic bag, a small, ordinary object that, for an entire generation, would come to mean something. That bag meant something because of what it represented, and what it represented went well beyond the transaction itself. A&B Sound was never just a place to buy a record or television. It was where a teenager first discovered the band that would define their adolescence, standing in an aisle with headphones on, unsure, until a clerk who actually knew the catalog leaned over and said, "Try this instead." It was where a father brought his son to buy his first guitar amp, passing down not just a purchase, but a small rite of passage. It was where families built an entire tradition around a single freezing morning each December. Parents who had once stood in that same line as teenagers, now bringing their own children to do exactly the same thing, decade after decade, without ever needing to explain why it mattered. In a region that watched national chain after national chain move in and try to compete, A&B Sound stood as something distinctly its own. Western Canadian, family-owned, unapologetically built around undercutting everyone else. And somehow, because of that stubbornness, more trusted than the competitors trying to outspend it, it gave a generation of young people their first jobs and their first real education in the culture of music itself, one recommendation at a time, across a sales floor that rewarded actually caring about what you sold. Nothing that came after it, not a bigger electronics chain, not a streaming app, not a website with infinite selection and no one behind the counter to ask, ever replicated what that specific combination of trust, community, and shared ritual had built. Somewhere in Vancouver tonight, someone is telling their grandchild about a night they camped outside a record store in the freezing cold just to save a few dollars on an album they'd already decided they had to own. The grandchild will not entirely understand why anyone would do that, why the cold mattered so little, why the record itself mattered so much, why standing in a line with hundreds of strangers felt less like an inconvenience and more like belonging to something. But they will hear it in the way the story is told, and they will understand that something real was there once, something built by one family on one simple promise that an entire region trusted for nearly 50 years. It closed the way it opened, quietly without ceremony, in a series of ordinary days that only looked significant afterward. There is no blame left to assign here, no villain to name beyond the plain fact that the world changed faster than any single store, however beloved, could change with it. What's left is simpler than blame. A name Vancouver still uses without thinking. A handful of buildings still waiting to become something new. And the memory of an orange bag, carried home on a cold December night, holding something that felt at the time like it would always be there to buy again.